Hey y'all, what is going on? What is going on? It's your girl, Melba Pearson, Melba for Miami, Melba for Justice, also known as the Resident Legal Diva, and welcome to another Mondays with Melba. So today is a special day on the show because today is Indigenous Peoples Day. Now, most of y'all are like, well, what's that? Okay, well, we all know about Columbus Day, but we also know, hopefully, most folks know that Columbus didn't exactly do right by our Indigenous peoples. And the history really gave rise to centuries of abuse that we're dealing with today. So I really wanted to center Indigenous peoples and talk about some of the history as well as some of what's happening today. And before I get in with my amazing guest, Summer Aubrey, who is an Indigenous tribal member with the Blackfeet and the Cherokee Nation. She's an attorney fighting for rights and the civil rights of Indigenous peoples. Before we get into all that, I want to just center this discussion a little bit with the history of Indigenous people in South Florida, because you know this is a Florida-based show, and so love to make sure that I drop a little bit of historic knowledge. Want to give a shout out to the Nootropic. Grace at the Nootropic actually shared some of this in her newsletter this week, so I'm lifting from that. I'm all about sharing the knowledge however you can. So just want to start off with that. So again, quoting from the Nootropic, outside of their reservations, today the legacy of Greater Miami's Indigenous peoples primarily lives on in our place names. So the name Miami itself comes from the word Mayomai, which is primarily credited to the Calusa people, which means big water. Dade, by the way, because we are Miami-Dade County, Dade is the last name of Major Francis L. Dade, who fought and was killed in the Seminole Wars. Whole other issue why we have a colonizing name in our county, but separate aspect. We'll deal with that at another point in time. So many of you may have heard of the city Opalaka. It's actually a shortened version of the Seminole phrase Opa Tishi Waka Laka, which roughly translated means a big island covered with many trees. The city of Hialeah, the name Hialeah, is generally credited to the Muskogee language as an amalgamation of words translating into pretty prairie. If you notice, if you go through the neighborhood of Allapattah, there's a lot of signs with alligators on them. Well, that's because Allapattah is a word from the Tequesta language, the Seminole language, which means alligator. Allapattah means alligator. So getting a little into the history, Miami was inhabited originally by Paleo Indians some 10,000 years ago, but our more recent and better known tribal history begins with the Tequesta people, who for the last 3,000 years or so centered their extensive southeastern Florida territory on the banks of the Miami River. And if you'd been watching the news over the last 20 years or so, when there was development, especially in the Brickell area, lots of artifacts from the Tequesta people were found. And then the question was how best to preserve that. The end of the Tequesta people came with their first contact with the Europeans in the 16th century. As a result of that contact, centuries of conflict followed, including slavery, disease, which virtually extinguished the Tequesta people by the 18th century. Members of the Creek Nation, who also became known as the Seminole and Miccosukee tribes, filled the vacuum left behind. And again, it turns out Seminole isn't an actual real Seminole word. So again, mixed mash of history and yeah, it's just very upsetting to really see all that. Violent conflict between the Seminole and Americans began within the early 1800s as the U.S. pushed into Florida, taking over tribal lands, and then, of course, into Spanish territory. The warring would go on into the mid-19th century and basically resulted in the death of many of the tribe's people. So you may wonder how we have the Miccosukee reservations and the Seminole reservations and why they are where they are. Well, after the conflict, basically the few folks who survived and who didn't end up on the reservation or ended up being forced or removed or relocated ended up retreating into the Everglades, basically into the wetlands in order to survive. So some of those surviving folks became the Seminoles and the Miccosukee tribal members members who eventually ended up forming a relationship with the United States government. The Seminole tribe did so in 1957, and the Miccosukes did in 1962. So just wanted to center that. And now I'm going to bring in my guest, Summer Aubrey. Thank you so much for joining me on Mondays with Melba. Please introduce yourself and tell folks a little bit about your history, your background, and the work that you do. And remember to take yourself off mute.
Yes, I'm terrible about the mute. Okay, first, so CO and OP. I'm Summer Aubrey. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and descendant of the Blackfeet Nation. I was born in Browning, Montana, which is kind of the heart of the Blackfeet Reservation. My father's Blackfeet, my mother's Cherokee. I spent my toddler years there until my parents split up, and then I grew up in Central Washington in a small farming community. And then I attended Central Washington University for my undergrad, and so I have degrees in law and justice and philosophy, and then minors in sociology and ethics. And then I found myself moving down to Arizona across the country to attend James E. Rogers College of Law at the University of Arizona. There I completed my JD and LLM, both with certificates in Indigenous Peoples Foreign Policy. And currently, I wear a lot of hats. So currently, I'm the law fellow for the Indigenous Human Rights Defenders and Corporate Accountability Program, housed at Water Protector Legal Collective. I'm also staff attorney for the International Indian Treaty Council, and I'm the co-director of Divest, Invest, Protect. So lots going on there.
Awesome. So can you share a little bit about what Indigenous Peoples Day means to you, especially as we're kind of shifting away from the usage of Columbus Day and moving towards, talking more about Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, definitely. So, Indigenous Peoples Day is to me the bare minimum of like recognizing our peoples and really the bare minimum and first step in decolonization, right? And it's so fitting that it's replacing Columbus Day. Because the way history is taught, particularly in the U.S. and all of that, a lot of folks don't know the horrific atrocities that Columbus perpetuated on Indigenous peoples and on my peoples on Turtle Island. He was a mass murderer, a serial rapist. He mutilated people for fun. He threw babies against rocks. And bashed their skulls in, and that was the reality of some of the first contact peoples, particularly the Tainos of Borican, or what we know today as Puerto Rico, and that violence perpetuated across Turtle Island, and that violence still exists today in a lot of our communities, and through the missing and murdered Indigenous women, Two-Spirit girls, and relatives crisis. So yeah, I'm so happy that Indigenous Peoples Day is gaining the traction it deserves in mainstream thought and consciousness, and it's very fitting that it's replacing Columbus Day.
So, pivoting from that, because, again, you think about the way history is taught in the United States, and it's very, to be blunt, whitewashed, right? Like Columbus came and discovered America, discovered all these islands, and it's like you can't discover what was already there, right? Like it's not like you found a new planet. Like people literally live there, and then the process of removing those people so that you can have their land, their crops, their women, whatever it is that you wanted to take away and strip from the people, folks kind of overlooked that, didn't discuss it, and now it's becoming more to the forefront. But I'm just curious about the relationship between what we saw in the atrocities that Columbus perpetuated upon Native people, and now the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And just to kind of drop out like a fact in there, and then, Summer, I definitely want to hear your thoughts on this. In doing my research for the show, I read that the National Crime Information Center, which is a criminal justice database that, is really available just to cops, right, to law enforcement. They tallied 6,000 reports of missing Indigenous women and girls in the year 2016. But if you look at the National and Missing and Unidentified Persons System, which is NAMIS, right, That's a different system that's being used by some members of law enforcement. It only shows 116. So the discrepancy between 6,000 missing versus 116 tallied, is there some connection there? What is that about?
Unfortunately, it boils down to racism, colonialism, and the perpetuated genocide of our peoples. I mean, it's very nuanced, and you can get to a lot of causes of why that is. But when you boil all those down, it's those three things. And it's a shame that they're so prevalent still today. I wrote from this when I was doing a Juris Doctorate, and it really got into these statistics and was talking about why this is, and basically it boils down to law enforcement just not caring. There's a lot of stereotypes about Indigenous women in particular. We're fetishized quite a bit, and there's a lot of families that come in to report their loved ones missing, and the response is, oh, they're just on a drinking bender, they'll come back in a couple days, I'm sure they're just out with their boyfriend, and they'll come back, and this is just what Indians do. And that's the general sentiment, and that's a very common sentiment that our communities and our families are facing with law enforcement. And it's just not taken seriously by law enforcement. And then there's also a lot of, because, and this comes back to the racism and the stereotyping of Indigenous peoples, right? Up until fairly recently, Indigenous peoples were not effectively represented in the media, right? Those old westerns and things we grew up with, depicting Indigenous peoples, a lot of those are played by Italian actors, and so we don't even really know in the mainstream consciousness what an Indigenous person looks like. And so because of that, there is a lot of mistaking for race and ethnicity. A lot of Indigenous peoples that are missing or murdered get categorized as Hispanic or Mexican, or Asian even too. And so it just comes down to, there's no education about what's going on, and when there is education, people don't care, and it comes down to people just not wanting this here.
And it is heartbreaking. I mean, the one thing I will, say that I've noticed a shift since the Gabby Petito case. And as many of you may remember, Gabby Petito was the blogger that was on the van trip with her boyfriend. And she ended up, there was an encounter with law enforcement where clearly she was in distress, and there was clear signs of domestic violence happening. And then basically her boyfriend ends up coming back home without her. Her body is later discovered, and he later makes an admission in writing after killing himself that he, in fact, was the one that ended her life. But that whole search for her and the media being captivated by this blonde-haired, blue-eyed, sort of social media star disappearing really overshadowed other missing women and girls of color, and the disparities in the coverage really became the story. Right now, of course, this is nothing against Gabby Petito and her family. Her family obviously did not want her to be the face of this. She obviously did not want that in her life, but it did kind of bring forward the discussion. And I noticed that now, for instance, there's a new show that's going to stream on Hulu. Don't know anything about it, but it's, Alaska Daily, which is a reporter researching, the murders of Indigenous women. And now you're starting to see on the Discovery ID channel more shows talking about missing Indigenous women and girls. So I'm heartened by that, but that's as in the last year. Like that's not covering, the decades before that, and the cold cases and the families that are still waiting for justice and closure to at least have a body to bury or have an answer or know what happened to their loved ones. So what are some ways, Summer, that folks can learn more, educate themselves, and also amplify this issue so that these families can get closure. Because again, the mainstream media is starting to catch up, but I wouldn't even say mainstream. I'd say more of your streaming services and other outlets where I think the artists and the directors and producer have a little bit more creative control. But it's not like necessarily you're going to turn on the channel, 6 p.m. news and see something about this. So how can we educate ourselves and get the word out?
I think, for the most part, it's doing your own research and really and it boils down to when you're doing your own research, when you are reading something from the point of view or something that's written by an Indigenous person about their experiences, which you should be doing anyway, believe them. It is as bad as we say. It is. They literally come hunting for us on our reservations because of the complexities in jurisdiction, and there are loopholes. And so, folks can get away with it. And those Indigenous peoples that experience sexual violence, of those, it's 96% are Indigenous that perpetuate those crimes against us. It is purposeful. They come to our communities on purpose because they know they can get away with it. They're predators, right? And so, and this is what's going on in Canada as well. And this is not just a phenomenon that's happening in the United States, right? This is happening all around the world with Indigenous peoples as a convergence of extractive industry, the climate crisis, and all of that, right? And so like femicidios in Mexico, and then the issues are very similar in Canada, and up there we have the Highway of Tears, right? Yes. Where hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, trans relatives are going missing, and we just don't know what's happening to them, right? And we have really high rates. I think it is the highest, last time I checked, the highest rates of sex trafficking and human trafficking around the world is Indigenous peoples. And that comes back to the racism and the stereotyping and the fetishization. And so it really, so when we say it's bad, they're hunting us, just believe us, and that's what's going on. And then to help us, advocate at your local and your state representatives in Congress. Vote for folks who want to support Indigenous issues. And Indigenous nations cannot prosecute these crimes as a general matter, because our tribal sovereignty and self-determination has been eroded, and it continuously will be eroded. The Castro Huerta case that just came out of Oklahoma, terrible, overturned over 250 years of case law precedent in Indian country. We have to redo all of our jurisdictional maps. Our charts that we learned in law school are different now, and it basically gives states jurisdiction over a lot of these crimes. And we have high prosecutorial declination rates. In 2019, when I published my paper on it, the prosecutorial declination rate at the federal level for these crimes, non-native, on-native violent crime, was upwards of 95%. And there was internal memoranda that said that, basically telling these federal prosecutors, don't prosecute this non-native on native crime. We don't really care. We have to allocate resources elsewhere. That was the gist of the memoranda. It's really important that we support politicians that support tribal sovereignty. It's really important that that also just educate yourselves. Don't let a lot of this this harmful rhetoric being taught in our schools today to our young children. If your children come home with that, go to your school board. That's really important. And then you're changing a whole generation, how they think and how they do. That's really important as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's so much to dissect there. I mean, definitely want to, touch on the prosecution aspect. Is, y'all know I'm a former prosecutor, and, tribal tribal nations don't have the ability to prosecute crimes that happen on their land. So the same way you'd think, okay, I live in Broward County, I live in Miami-Dade County, I live in, wherever in Gainesville, like, your local prosecutor handles all the cases that come out of that area. You'd think that the sovereign nations of Indigenous people would be able to handle any cases that come on their land. That's not the case. It's usually misdemeanors and lower level cases that they're allowed to handle on their level. And then, but if a homicide or a sexual assault occurs on native lands, often that's federal prosecutors that come in and handle it. And then that goes to the whole allocation of resources when the feds are sitting there looking at their caseload, and they're like, listen, do I want to go after this case that's going to be complicated? And I'm going to have to, probably spend more time on the reservation, literally, as opposed to being able to be home, when I can maybe pursue this other case where I can just have the detective come in and, it's just the easier lift. You may go for that as opposed to, really working on what's happening in native land. But just curious though, and then one more thing, and then I'll circle back to this question, but I'm curious to know, with Deb Haaland being appointed as Interior Secretary, if you've seen a shift in federal policy when it comes to Indigenous peoples as opposed to in prior, administrations. But before you answer that question, just want to remind folks that when you want to educate yourself, it's super easy now. You can literally go on TikTok, go on Instagram, and literally put in the search bar, Indigenous activists, Indigenous teachers, whatever, you're curious about. And you can find really amazing artist. I mean, I follow this one model who just, she models a lot of Indigenous clothes, but then she tells the story of the significance of what she's wearing, or the history behind, a particular outfit and why that was important to Indigenous peoples and their history. So you can learn about Indigenous peoples from so many different angles, and you have it all right here on your phone. Like, you don't have to go to the library like we did back in the day, right? And actually pull a book off the shelf and read it. You can literally Google something or go on your favorite social media outlet and learn more, follow people that are different to you. So anyway, pausing there, going back to you, Summer, if you could share a little bit about Deb Haaland, and also if there's any other sites or organizations or groups that folks should follow to be able to learn more and educate themselves on this issue.
Yeah, definitely. So, of course, we love that Deb Haaland is Secretary of Interior. That historically means a lot, right? That we have someone that, and also for folks that don't know, right? Like, we have a special political status with the United States government, and we are literally governed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is housed in the Department of Interior. And this is the first time that the Secretary of Interior has been an Indigenous person, and that means a lot when policy comes down and affects our people, right? So I just wanted to frame that, how important her position is. Definitely there is a huge shift at the White House and across the government. There are a lot more consultations now. I don't particularly like consultations. I advocate for free, prior, and informed consent, which is enumerated in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and sort of the gold standard for Indigenous peoples around the world if done correctly. Yeah, there's a lot more consultations happening. The White House definitely has their ears open to Indigenous issues and Indigenous leaders. They have hired several positions to be tribal liaisons or Indigenous peoples liaisons, and I've had the pleasure of speaking with some of those folks. They're really wonderful of getting people's ears or giving us email addresses if we need to advocate to someone in particular, which is a breath of fresh air. It makes working in these spaces a lot easier. Unfortunately, that's kind of where it ends. It ends up being a lot of lip service. It ends up, there is still more money's being allocated, but a lot of that is done so in the way of competitive grants. And so that's also an issue, right? When Indigenous nations don't necessarily have the resources to have a grant writer on staff, or to even be competing. Just the notion of competing for a grant with another Indigenous nation when the United States has a trust and fiduciary responsibility to ensure that we have the resources that we need is just kind of mind-boggling. So that's those things are still going on. I don't think that's going away anytime soon. But it's nice that we're finally getting the ears of some of these folks that are creating these policy. And I think we are changing minds. And I think people are really seeing the plight that we face in Indian country, for various issues, and particularly the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and trans relatives crisis.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, at least steps in the right direction. Clearly not there yet, but I in my gut, and I mean, you can tell me if I'm wrong, it just feels like there's been a little bit more traction in the last 2 to 4 years than I've seen in my entire legal career, and just generally, seeing what's going on in the world, right? Like, again, we weren't discussing these issues on social media. Like, I think 2016, 2017, that just wasn't a thing. Like, I heard about the missing Indigenous women and girls, and again, mostly because I obsessively watch crime shows, but that's how I knew about the Highway of Tears. And then, of course, having spent lots of summers in Canada, because hello, every Jamaican has relatives in Toronto. That's just the reality. But anyway, I learned more about, the horrible Indigenous schools where basically children were taken from their families and placed into these, schools to indoctrinate them and make them basically more white, make them fit in, take them from their family and their traditions and place them with white families because somehow that was better. And how Prime Minister Trudeau came out and finally issued an apology. However, we've never really apologized in the United States to the Indigenous peoples for how they were treated. And again, this was a limited sort of circumstance and sort of a limited apology, but at least there was some acknowledgement that atrocities happened and that the government was at fault. So that's something I'd love to see here in the United States, but it is what it is. We are where we are. So baby steps, let's educate ourselves and all that. But just to wrap things up, Summer, how can folks find you, learn more about the work you're doing? And are there any other relevant websites or social media influencers in Indigenous heritage that, folks should follow and learn more about?
Yeah, definitely. Before I do that, I do want to touch on what you just said about the residential schools, right? That is one thing that Deb Haaland took up when she became secretary. We do have this massive report now that is using government funds to find graves of our lost ancestor children, which is amazing. And so we have this great report now that came out of DOI in late April, early May. It's very long, but it's still more work needs to be done. But this was the first instance that the United States government even acknowledged their rights, right? And I think it's really important that we're entering this era because we are really only in the first generation that is being able to raise our own children. The last residential schools closed, even though made illegal in the 70s. The last schools didn't close until the late 80s and early 90s. And right, yes. And so and with ICWA up too. ICWA's up on the chopping block, this term in SCOTUS, which we're very, very scared about because our children are still taken at the highest rates of any other demographic and placed into non-Indigenous homes. There's no even though ICWA is great in everything and we appreciate the protections it provides our people, there is no method for which anyone's monitoring that. So a lot of jurisdictions just forego ICWA, and there's kind of no recompense for that too. So I wanted to touch on that because that is coming up. I suspect anyway, I hope it doesn't, I hope I'm wrong, but I think it was going to fall. And that's going to be detrimental to our communities. And I did want to say that. As for me, I have pretty much all social media. I'm on TikTok, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram. I'm not real good at posting to social media. I try to, I'm most active on Facebook, and I try to keep it more advocacy based, especially now that I work a lot with like private security and stuff like that. So I try to keep it more advocacy based rather than personal. Let's see, and that's where a lot of this missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and trans relatives is happening too, is on Facebook, right? Is because the police departments aren't really doing what they're supposed to be doing. And we can also get into that about the '05 decision that police don't have the duty to serve and protect, so they don't do that anyway. But they're not doing their jobs. And so there's a group of people, Indigenous women in particular, across the nation that take it upon themselves to create these Facebook groups that monitor who's going missing, who's being found, and how long they've been missing for, and really connecting people with the families, making missing person flyers and being able to share those virtually. It's really easy to find those sites. There's hundreds of them. So just put in your search bar, missing murdered Indigenous women, missing murdered Indigenous people. They'll come up. Be a part of those groups, and I will say, content warning, pictures of folks who have been made deceased do pop up on there to try and identify victims and try and find families and try and return our relatives back home. So just be cognizant of that, but please be a part of those groups and please share those missing persons flyers and try and help us identify our relatives and bring them back home.
Wow. And with that, thank you again, Summer, for coming on to Mondays with Melba and, sharing a bit of your experience as well as sharing some really important context and ways that folks can get engaged. So I hope that everybody listening, watching, will take this to heart and get involved because, again, this is something super simple. You're a part of how many Facebook groups already as it is, right? You follow so many different social media influencers. Why not follow one more where you can have a positive impact, right? So I'm going to be dropping some resources in the comments as well as in the body. If you're listening to this on the podcast, in the description, you'll be able to hit some links as well. But do your own research and do what you can to be able to help bring justice to these families and to bring, these girls and women and folks just back home, because that's what's most important. So with that, y'all, that concludes Indigenous Peoples Day here at Mondays with Melba. Thank you again for tuning in and take good care. Bye-bye.